There's a photograph on my phone I've never deleted. I didn't take it for the reasons most people take photos at Buckingham Palace. I wasn't trying to catch the guards mid-blink or get a selfie with the bearskin hat filling the frame. I took it because something in that moment felt wrong in a way I couldn't name yet, and my hand moved before my brain did. The photograph shows two guards standing in their sentry boxes on a gray Tuesday in November. You can tell it's cold from the way the tourists in the background are hunched into their coats, chins tucked, hands buried in pockets. The sky looks like wet concrete, the kind of London sky that feels permanent, like it's always been that color and always will be. One guard is facing forward the way they're supposed to, chin level, eyes straight. That particular blankness they train into them, the expression that isn't really an expression, just a face arranged to communicate that they are not there as a person, only as a presence. The other guard, the one on the left, has his mouth slightly open. That's all. That's the photograph. A mouth, barely parted, like the first syllable of a word that never finished. I didn't know, when I took it, what I'd actually captured. I'd been in London for 11 days by then, which is long enough to stop treating the city like a postcard and start treating it like a place. You stop photographing every red phone box. You learn which tube lines to avoid at rush hour. You develop opinions about which chippy near your flat does the batter right. I was staying in a rented room in Pimlico, about a 20-minute walk from the palace, and I'd fallen into the habit of walking that way in the mornings because it was a good loop past the gardens, along the mall, back through St. James's Park home. Not sightseeing, just walking. The kind of walking you do when you're in a new city and you're trying to get your bearings not just geographically, but internally, in that way you sometimes need when your life has recently done something unexpected. I won't go into what brought me to London. It's not the point. But I'll say this, I was in that particular emotional state where you notice things too carefully, where your attention has been scraped raw and every detail lands harder than it should. A stranger's laugh, the smell of frying onions from a cart, the sound of pigeons, that specific, slightly desperate flapping. All of it too loud, all of it too much. That's probably why I noticed him. His name, I found out later, much later, through a sequence of events I'll get to, was Corporal Daniel Marsh. 26 years old, third year in the household division. He'd been stationed at the palace on rotation for 8 months, which is long enough to know every crack in the pavement, every regular tourist, every shift change to the minute. But I didn't know any of that on the Tuesday morning in November. I only knew what I saw, which was a young man standing at attention outside the North Center gate in a uniform that must weigh about 20 pounds, in weather that was probably 8 degrees with wind that felt like 5, doing the thing that British ceremonial guards do, which is exist in public as though they are alone. I'd passed him before, several times on my morning walks. I'd done what most people do, glanced, registered, moved on. He was part of the scenery, the same as the iron railings or the stone pillars. That Tuesday, for no particular reason, I stopped. Not close. Not directly in front of the box where the tourists cluster and test the no-talking rule with whispered dares and held-out cameras. I stopped about 30 feet away, off to the side, near one of the planters. I had a coffee in a paper cup. It was burning my hand through the cardboard sleeve, and I was trying to decide if I cared enough to put it down. I watched him, and watch him the way you watch something when you have nothing else to do with your eyes, and your mind is quiet enough to actually see. Not the picture-taking kind of watching. The noticing kind. What I noticed first was how still he was. I know that sounds obvious. That's the whole point of them. The stillness, that's the performance. But there's a difference between knowing something intellectually and watching it for 3 uninterrupted minutes. Real stillness is unsettling. The human body isn't designed for it. We're twitching animals. We shift weight, blink, swallow, drift. To remove all of that is to do something faintly unnatural, and if you watch it long enough, it starts to look less like discipline and more like effort. He was working. The stillness wasn't passive. It was maintained. You could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his chest moved with each breath in the controlled pattern of someone who has been taught to breathe without moving their shoulders. I found myself holding my own breath, which is a stupid thing to do, and then letting it out slowly. A group of teenagers stopped a few feet to my left, jostling each other, one of them holding up his phone like a bat. They took photos. One of them said something loud and juvenile in German. I don't speak German, but the delivery was universal, and his friends laughed. The guard didn't react. The teenagers lost interest within 90 seconds and moved on toward the Victoria Memorial, already opening snack packaging. I stayed. The second guard arrived at 10:43. I know the time because I checked my phone as he came around the corner from the side of the gatehouse. Not walking ceremonially, just walking the way anyone walks when they're early and not yet technically on duty. He was maybe 24, shorter than the first guard, with a walk that had a slight forward lean to it, like he was always arriving somewhere urgently. He came to stand beside the first guard's box, and I saw them exchange something. Not words yet, just the particular stillness of two people who know each other, who have stood beside each other in this exact spot many times, and who are acknowledging that without making a production of it. There's a protocol for the changeover. I know this because I looked it up afterward, but even before I looked it up, I could tell there was a protocol because everything here has a protocol, and the way both of them held themselves at that moment, the arriving guard and the standing guard, had the quality of something rehearsed, choreographed, performed hundreds of times until it was indistinguishable from instinct. They stood side by side, which is when the arriving guard, the one who had come around the corner with that urgent lean, bent his head by perhaps 2 degrees and said something. I couldn't hear it. I was 30 feet away, and there was traffic noise from a mall and wind coming in off the park. But I saw the mouth move, and I saw the shape of what it was short. For words, maybe 5. The compression of a sentence to its absolute minimum. The first guard, Corporal Marsh, though I didn't know his name yet, didn't move. Not a muscle, but something happened to his face. Something so small I almost missed it. The blankness didn't break. It couldn't, not here, not with tourists around, but it shifted, like a wall that doesn't crack but hums, like there's something pressing from the other side. My hand came up with my phone. I took the photograph. I kept walking after that. Got to the end of the mall, cut through the park, watched a pelican of the lake do something pompous and unimpressed with a fish, and walked home. Made eggs. Called my sister. Told her the eggs were good. Didn't tell her about the photograph. Didn't tell her about the guard. Wouldn't have been able to explain it anyway. What was there to explain? A man's mouth opened. Another man's face went still in a different way. Nothing happened. And yet, I pulled up the photo 3 times that afternoon, each time telling myself I was going to delete it because my camera roll was already overloaded, and each time not deleting it. There was something in the first guard's face that I recognized. The particular rigidity of a person who has just been handed something heavy and has decided in real time to carry it without letting anyone see the weight. I'd worn that expression. I knew what it cost. I didn't know yet what he'd been given to carry. That came later. That came from a man named Terrence, who ran a small tea stall on the south side of St. James's Park, who had worked that pitch for 19 years, and who had, as he described it, developed the habit of watching the gates the way other men watch football, with loyalty, with attention, and with a comprehensive memory for significant plays. I met Terrence on a Thursday. By then, Corporal Marsh was gone. Terrence was in his mid-60s with a white mustache he seemed very at peace with, and a Scottish accent that had spent so many decades in London it had softened to something mid-Atlantic, warm and imprecise. He sold tea and filter coffee and, on cold days, a lamb pasty from a place in Victoria that he spoke about with a reverence usually reserved for religious sites. I bought a coffee, which was not as good as the reverence suggested it might be, and I made the mistake of mentioning I'd been walking past the palace most mornings. He gave me a look. "You there Tuesday?" I said I was. He nodded slowly, like I confirmed something he'd suspected. Then he looked out toward the gates, which you could see from his stall if you knew where to look, and he picked up a rag and wiped down the counter that didn't need wiping, and he said, "Lad's been reassigned." I asked him what he meant. He told me. Not all of it. Terrence didn't have all of it. Nobody outside the regiment, and the palace administration had all of it, and most of them weren't talking. But Terrence had 19 years of watching, and he had contacts the way long-tenured observers always develop contacts. Quietly, accidentally, through a decade of small kindnesses and consistent presence until certain people started saying things in his direction on the understanding that he was discreet. What Terrence told me. The guard who had arrived beside Corporal Marsh on Tuesday morning, the one who had been his head and spoken 4 or 5 words, had come from inside, from the briefing room. He had, according to the version Terrence had heard from a woman whose brother worked logistics for the household division, received information that morning. Information pertaining to Corporal Marsh specifically. What kind of information? Terrence picked up his rag again. The kind, he said, that you don't deliver to a man standing at his post. He let that sit. I waited. And yet he said, there it is. I didn't sleep well Thursday night, which wasn't unusual for that period of my life, but the reason was unusual. It wasn't my own thoughts chasing their own tails, the familiar insomnia of the recently destabilized. It was Corporal Marsh's face, the face in the photograph, that particular held quality of a person receiving the undeliverable. I've been given news like that once. Not the same news. Probably, I don't know what his news was. I still don't know the specifics, only the shape of it. But the moment of receiving it, the way your body has to decide, in about half a second, what to do with the fact that the world has just fundamentally rearranged itself while everything around you is exactly the same as it was. If you're standing at a kitchen table, you can sit down. You can hold onto the back of a chair. You can press your forehead against a wall. If you're standing at attention outside Buckingham Palace with tourists taking photographs of your hat, you do nothing. You do nothing at all. And that's what he did. He stood there, I think, for another 40 minutes, until his relief came officially at the proper time. He went through the changeover. He walked back inside. And then somewhere in the process that follows, the debriefing, the welfare check, the conversations that happen in rooms I will never have access to, someone decided he needed to be somewhere else. Not as punishment. That's what Terrence was careful to say. He said it twice, unprompted, which made me think he'd had this conversation before, and found that people jumped to the wrong conclusion. Not a punishment, he said. A reassignment. Different entirely. If you've been in any kind of service. Punishment you come back from. Reassignment, he turned back to the counter. That's just where you are now. I looked at my coffee. What did he whisper? I asked. Terrence was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, something no man should receive standing up. He didn't say anything else. I didn't ask again. The thing about London in November is that it conspires. Not against you exactly. More the way water conspires when it freezes. Not with intention. Just with the slow, indifferent inevitability of a thing following its nature. The gray closes in. The light thins. The city turns inward on itself. And if you're already in a tender state, already walking around with your nerve endings too close to the surface, November London will find every single one of them. I kept going back. I told myself it was the walk, the routine, the structure of it, which is what you lean on when other structures have given way. At 9:30, coffee from the cart near Victoria, down the mall, past the gates, through the park, home by 11. Good for the body. Good for the discipline of a day. The photograph stayed on my phone. I looked at it more than I looked at anything else. More than the emails I was behind on. More than the messages from people being patient with my absence in ways that made the absence worse. More than the weather app I downloaded and kept forgetting to check, so that I was always wrongly dressed for whatever London had decided to do that day. I kept looking at that open mouth, that near word, that fraction of a syllable frozen at the moment before it became language and, therefore, before it became real. On the Friday, 3 days after the photograph, I walked past the gate, and there was a different guard in the left box. I'd known there would be. Terrence had told me, but knowing and seeing are the same transaction you have to complete twice, and completion the second time costs something. The new guard was older, broader, with a redness to his cheeks that suggested either the cold or a disposition toward it. He stood the way they all stand, chin level, eyes forward, the particular absence of a person who is present as function rather than self. The left box, that was Marsh's box. I didn't know that on Tuesday, but I'd thought about it since. The way you reconstruct spatial details after the fact, the mind filling in the map it failed to draw at the time. He would have had a box, a specific assignment on this section of the wall, on this rotation, on this shift. Soldiers aren't interchangeable units, even when the ceremony requires them to perform as though they are. They have their posts, their rotations, their colleagues who know them by the particular quality of their silence. And now someone else was standing in his particular silence. The new guard didn't know I was looking. Why would he? I was just another woman in a coat, too thin for the weather, standing slightly too far away to be a normal tourist. I turned and walked into the park. There's a bench near the Pelican enclosure that I'd begun to think of as mine. The way you do with benches in cities when you're there long enough and lonely enough to form attachments to municipal furniture. It was usually empty in the mornings, which was the point. The Pelicans were there at all hours, performing their spectacular indifference. I sat down and took out my phone, not to look at the photograph this time. I decided at some point during the walk to try to find out what I could. Not from Terrence, who had reached the edge of what he knew and would not speculate past it. I respected that about him. Not from the official channels, which were sealed in the way official channels always are when they want to perform transparency without providing it. I was on a look for Daniel Marsh the way you look for anyone now, which is imperfectly, obliquely, through the accumulated digital sediment of a person's public life. There wasn't much. There wouldn't be. Soldiers in the household division aren't encouraged toward visibility. They don't have public Instagram accounts with photographs of themselves in uniform outside pubs. The ones that do tend to be former, and they're usually careful. But there are traces. There are always traces. A tag photograph from a regimental event 2 years back where someone had included names in a caption. A brief local news piece from a town in Shropshire about a young man from the area being posted to the Palace Guard. The kind of hometown pride story that small papers run when nothing else is happening. A name on a 5K fundraiser list from 2021, registered as a participant with the regiment listed in brackets after it. Daniel Marsh, Shrewsbury, 26. In a local news piece, there was a photograph that had been taken, by the look of it, at a barbecue. He was in civilian clothes, a white t-shirt, laughing at something outside the frame. There was a woman beside him with dark hair and a hand on his arm. Not posed. Just happened. I sat with that for a moment. The man in the barbecue photograph had absolutely no relationship, visually, to the man in the sentry box. Not because he looked different. You could tell it was the same person, the same particular set of the jaw, the same slightly square shape to his face. But because the barbecue man was made of motion. Even in a still photograph, there was the sense of a body that moved easily through its life, laughed without calculating the cost, let someone's hand rest on his arm without tallying what it meant. The sentry box man was what happened to a person after years of training that movement to stillness. And then someone had handed him something standing in that stillness that hit the stillness like a stone into ice. I found Terrence on the Saturday at his usual spot, which was comforting. I'd half expected him not to be there, the way important people in stories sometimes disappear between chapters. He was making tea for a couple with a stroller, and he had the ease of a man conducting a performance he'd run thousands of times without it ever becoming less than genuine. He handed over the cups with a small nod that managed to be both businesslike and warm, a nod that said, "I see you," and "You're welcome here, and I have 17 other customers, but you are specifically you right now." And when the couple had moved on, he turned and looked at me with an expression that said he'd known I was coming. "Back again," he said. "Back again," I agreed. He poured without asking. Tea this time, not coffee, and it was better. The coffee was for tourists, I'd come to understand. The tea was for people he decided were staying. I told him about the barbecue photograph, the one from the local paper, the woman with the dark hair. He nodded. "Sister," he said, "or was few years back." I didn't ask what was meant. He didn't explain it. And I understood, sitting there with the tea warming both hands, that I had just been handed the edge of the thing, the shape of it. The reason Tuesday's delivered words had carried the particular weight they carried. Not all of it. The specifics were not mine, and would never be mine, and I found I didn't want them, the way you sometimes realize at the last moment before crossing a threshold that the threshold exists for a reason. What I had was enough. A young man stationed at a ceremonial post, doing his job with the particular totality that job requires. A colleague who had come from a briefing room with something in his face that you couldn't put down. Or 5 words, bent toward near. The kind of words that rearrange everything. And then 40 minutes of standing. 40 minutes of breathing without moving your shoulders, keeping your chin level, keeping the blankness in place while tourists angle their phones at your hat. And the November wind came in off the park, and the world continued being the world around the sealed fact inside you. I don't know if it's bravery, exactly. I'm not sure bravery is the right word. Bravery is usually about choosing to move toward a danger. This was the opposite, the choice not to move at all. The choice to hold the post, because the post needed holding even when everything underneath you had shifted. Terrence put both hands on the counter. You know what I think about? Sometimes, he said. It wasn't really a question. All the things those lads have heard. Standing out there, day after day, tourists shouting nonsense at them. Trying to make them blink. Trying to make them laugh. Thinking they're the first one to try the bit. He paused. But sometimes it's not tourists. I waited. Sometimes it's the wind carrying something, he said. Sometimes it's a colleague who couldn't wait. He picked up the rag, and they have to take it standing up. He started wiping down the counter again. Not right, he said, but that's the job. I went back to my flat and sat at the small table by the window and opened my laptop and did not look at anything on it for 20 minutes. The flat had been a good choice. I'd chosen it because the window looked south and caught light in the afternoons, which the listing had described as charming afternoon sun, and which was accurate enough that I hadn't felt deceived. But in November, the light was thin and slant and lasted about 40 minutes before the gray reclaimed everything. I thought about what Terrence had said. Not right, but that's the job. There's a category of things in life that fit inside that sentence. Things that are wrong in a traceable, specific way. Wrong because the timing is wrong. Wrong because the delivery is wrong. Wrong because a person should be allowed to receive certain information in private, in a chair with a glass of water available, and someone willing to sit with the silence afterward. Things that happen anyway, because the system running them was built without a slot for those requirements. The regiment, I imagined, had protocols for this. There would be a notification system, a chain, a correct and established way of handling the communication of significant personal news to a soldier on active ceremonial duty. That chain existed, presumably, for exactly the reason I was now sitting at a table thinking about, because delivering it wrong broke something. Something had gone wrong in the chain. Someone had known and said so, standing beside a sentry box at 10:43 on a Tuesday morning in November, into an ear that then had to carry it for 40 minutes without a chair. I pulled up the photograph again. The mouth, barely open. The first syllable of a word that became everything. I emailed my sister that night. Not about any of this. About the eggs, which I was getting better at. About a bookshop I'd found in Marylebone with a section of Irish lit that had made me feel briefly, almost painfully, like myself. About whether she thought I was ready to come home yet. She wrote back within 10 minutes, which is how she has always been. The one who responds immediately, without overthinking, without leaving things unread until she's composed herself. She said, "You'll know when you know." But yes, probably. I read it 3 times. Then I made tea, properly this time the way Terrence had made it, which is to say with actual patience. And I stood at the window and watched the light go, which takes about 30 seconds in London in November, which is another thing November does. I thought about Daniel Marsh, where he was, now that he was somewhere else. What reassigned looked like in practice, a different barracks, a different post, a desk job, a leave period. I didn't know. I still don't know. The Army is its own country, and I was a tourist in it the same as I was a tourist in London, which is to say I had walked its perimeter without access to its interior. But I thought about the act of being moved. Because here's the thing about reassignment that Terrence had been careful to say and that I'd only half understood at the time. It isn't punishment, but it is acknowledgement. It is the institution admitting, by moving you, that something has happened to you, that you are changed, that the post you occupied yesterday cannot be reoccupied by the same person today, because the person is not the same. They moved him, which means on some level they knew. They knew the 40 minutes had cost something that couldn't be put back exactly as it was. They knew the Sentry box required a version of you that you had to carefully maintain, and that maintaining it required all of you completely, and that if something had cracked in the foundation of you, not broken, not collapsed, but cracked the way good walls crack, the maintenance became a different kind of weight. Not impossible, just different. And they had decided, whoever makes those decisions, that the different weight wasn't the right weight for that particular post at that particular time. Reassigned. A word that sounds administrative. That is entirely administrative on paper. That functions in practice as a strange and institutional form of care. Rough-edged, imperfect, impersonal, and yet somehow present in the decision. We see that something has happened to you. You're going somewhere else for a while. I don't know if he understood it that way. I don't know if it helped. I stood at the window until the tea was cold. Then I put my coat on and went outside because the flat had gotten small in the way flats do when you're inside your own head, and because the cold had the quality of useful discomfort, and because London at night, even cold November London, is generous to people who need to be outside. I walked south, away from the palace, this time, toward the river. The river at night in November smells like something that has been patient for a very long time. Not unpleasant, just deep, old. The kind of smell that doesn't ask anything of you, which is the smell I needed. I walked along the embankment for an hour with my hands in my pockets and my breath clouding ahead of me, and I didn't think about anything important, which was a significant achievement for that period of my life. I thought about the lights on the opposite bank. I thought about the particular geometry of bridges. I thought about whether the lamb Pasty Terrence had mentioned was available anywhere else, and whether I was brave enough to find out, and what brave even means when applied to pastry. Small thoughts, low-altitude thoughts, the kind that keep you airborne without requiring altitude. I walked back to Pimlico at around 11 and slept better than I had all week. The following Tuesday, a full 7 days after the photograph, I walked past the gates at the same time. Habit, or something more deliberate than habit, that was using habit as camouflage. The guard in the left box was the new one again, the broad one with the reddish cheeks, who had settled into the post with the comfortable authority of a man who does not overthink his presence in a location. He looked, if anything, slightly more settled than he had on Friday, which I suppose is what a week does. The gate, the railings, the tourists with their phones, all exactly the same. I stopped at my spot, the planter, 30 feet away, slightly to the side, and I stood there for a moment with my coffee burning my hand through the cardboard sleeve, and I thought, this is what institutions run on. The particular sameness of this, the continuity, the fact that the box gets filled, the post gets stood, the ceremony continues, regardless of what passed through it the week before. That's not callousness, or it's not only callousness. It's also a kind of assurance, the proof of something persisting. But I missed a face. Not Marsh specifically, though yes, him. The particular face I'd seen at the moment of receiving, the face that had been handed something it had to hold without letting go of the surface it was maintaining. I miss that face the way you miss a piece of evidence after it's been removed from a room, even though you know the evidence has rights of its own, has a life of its own, has somewhere else it belongs. I took one last look at the new guard. He was fine. He was doing his job. He would do his job for however long they stationed him here, and then he would be rotated somewhere else, and another guard would fill the box, and the box would continue to be filled. I turned away. 2 days later, I met a man named Simon at a pub quiz in Vauxhall. This has nothing to do with the story, except that it has everything to do with why I can tell it now with the distance I'm telling it with, which requires some perspective I didn't have in those 11 days, and which Simon, over several months and a quantity of mediocre pub quiz performances, helped me find. Simon was a former Royal Marine, 8 years, out now, working in logistics management, which he described with the deadpan resignation of a man who had learned to coexist with his own choices. He had a precise way of holding a pint that spoke of someone who had spent significant time in formal settings and had let the precision bleed into everything, including casual drinking. I told him about the photograph on our third or fourth meeting when we'd reached the stage of telling each other things that required context. He looked at it for a long time. Changeover, he said immediately. I told him I knew. I told him about the second guard arriving. The bent head. The 4 or 5 words. Simon nodded. Poor timing, he said, which was so massively understated I almost laughed. I asked him if it was common, receiving news like that at your post. Not the specific news, but the category of it. He thought about it. He had the habit of actually thinking before answering, which is rarer than it should be. Depends, he said. If they know in advance, they pull you before it can happen. Family liaison officer, welfare NCO. There's a process. He turned his pint. But sometimes the knowing and the telling get misaligned. Misaligned. I let that word sit in my mouth for a moment, where it tasted like an extremely polite way of describing a kind of violence. The reassignment, I said. Is that standard? If someone receives significant news on post, he said, and the chain identifies it as likely to affect function, yes. You don't leave a compromised guard on a public ceremonial post. Not out of cruelty. He paused. Out of the same reason you don't drive a car with a cracked windscreen. You can still see through it. But the integrity is affected. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The integrity is affected. Such a structural way of describing what happens to a person when the world rearranges itself mid-sentence. As though the person is a load-bearing element, and the crack changes the math of what they can bear. As though the reassignment is an engineer's decision, made cleanly, without judgment. Maybe that's the kindness of it, actually, the absence of judgment. The language that doesn't ask you to explain what happened to you or prove how much it broke. That just says, you have a crack. We're putting you somewhere the load is different for now. No shame in the maths. I left London in December. I've been back twice since, both times briefly, both times for reasons that had nothing to do with Buckingham Palace or Sentry boxes or a photograph on my phone. But both times I found myself walking that route. Out at 9:30, coffee from the car down the mall past the gates. Habit, this time genuinely. The second trip back, I stopped at Terrence's stall. He looked exactly the same. The mustache, the rag, the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have occupied a single geography long enough that their body has mapped every inch of it. He remembered me. Haven't heard anything more, he said before I asked. Not my business to hear, really. Just the once was. He poured without asking. Tea, because apparently I was that now. Hope the lad's all right. Hope the lad's all right. 7 words. No ceremony. No speculation. Just the plain decency of a man who'd watched enough of the world from a stall beside a park to know that sometimes that's all there is to say. I drank the tea. It was good tea. The photograph is still on my phone. I've stopped looking at it as often, which is a form of progress, I suppose, the same way you stop pressing a bruise as often when it's in the process of healing. But I don't delete it. I don't think I will. Not because it's a great photograph. It isn't. It's a slightly blurry mid-shot of 2 guards on a gray Tuesday morning. One of them with his mouth barely open, the other with his face arranged in the trained blankness that is what the job requires. You could walk past it in any collection of tourist photos, and your eye would keep moving. But I know what's in it. I know the 4 or 5 words that existed between those 2 faces, passed in the compressed space of a bent head in the cold November air at the worst possible time, and the only time there was. I know the 40 minutes that followed. I know the photograph I couldn't find of the woman with the dark hair, and the word was in the small local paper that had run a story about a boy from Shropshire who was going somewhere important. I know the reassignment. I know the new guard in the left box, doing his job with efficient, uncomplicated competence, completely unaware that he is standing in a space that carries a different weight than he knows. I know Terrence, and his tea, and his 19 years of watching, and the careful way he handles what he has been trusted with. And I know, because Simon explained it, and because I have thought about it so many times since that it has become a kind of certainty, what that moment of stillness was. Not discipline exactly, not performance. Something deeper and older and more costly than either of those things. The choice to hold. When everything underneath you has shifted, when the ground has just done the thing ground is not supposed to do, when the fact inside you is new and enormous and wants enormously to be acknowledged, the choice to hold your position. to breathe without moving your shoulders, to keep the chin level, to wait until the correct moment to carry it somewhere else. Not because the holding is without cost, because the post is yours, and the post needs standing. I've thought about what I would say to him if I ever met Daniel Marsh. Outside the uniform, somewhere neutral, a pub, maybe, or a cafe, somewhere with chairs you could choose to sit in or not. I've composed it in my head the way you compose things you're never going to say, which is with more honesty than you'd use if you were actually going to say them. I'd probably say, I took a photograph of you without knowing I was taking a photograph of something that mattered. And I'd probably say, I hope that somewhere else was better. And then I'd probably not say the thing I actually want to say, which is, I recognized it. The weight of carrying it standing up. I know that face. I've worn it. You held your post that day in a way that cost you something real, and I saw it, and I will not pretend I didn't. I'd probably not say that, but I'd mean it.